The Federal Reserve has a problem it can't admit publicly. For the first time since 1971, the system that replaced gold is breaking. And unlike Nixon, Jerome Powell can't just change the rules and expect the world to accept it, because here's what nobody wants to say out loud. The only reason U.S. Treasury bonds are considered the safest asset on earth isn't because America is the most stable economy. It's because for 50 years, everyone agreed to pretend they were safe. It was a collective illusion. And China just stopped pretending. Let me show you how fragile this actually is. When you hear that the U.S. national debt is $34 trillion, your brain probably stops processing the number. It's too big, abstract, irrelevant to daily life. But here's what that number actually means. The United States government has borrowed $34 trillion, mostly by selling bonds to foreign countries, pension funds, and central banks, and it has promised to pay all of that back with interest. The problem? It can't. Not without printing more money. And printing more money causes inflation. And inflation destroys the value of the bonds that foreigners are holding, which means the people who lent America money get paid back in currency that's worth less than when they bought the bonds in the first place. It's a slow motion default, and everyone in the system knows it. For decades, this didn't matter because there was no alternative. If you were a central bank managing $100 billion in reserves, where else could you put it? European bonds? Too fragmented? Japanese bonds? Negative interest rates? Chinese bonds? Not liquid enough? Gold? Doesn't pay interest and can't fund daily transactions? So you held dollars, you bought treasuries, and you accepted the slow erosion of value because it was still better than the chaos of trying to exit the system. But that calculation only works if everyone keeps playing, and China just stopped. In 2016, something unusual happened that almost nobody noticed at the time. The International Monetary Fund added the Chinese yuan to its special drawing rights basket. That's a boring technical term for something incredibly significant. It meant the yuan was now officially recognized as a global reserve currency alongside the dollar, the euro, the yen, and the pound. It was a symbolic move. The yuan still represented less than 3% of global reserves, but symbolism matters in financial systems because money is belief. And the IMF had just validated the belief that there could be an alternative to the dollar. China took notes. Within 2 years, Beijing launched something called the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, CIPS for short. If that sounds boring, it should. It was designed to sound boring because what CIPS actually does is allow countries to trade with each other in yuan without touching the US financial system at all. No dollar conversion, no SWIFT network, no American visibility or control, and it worked. By 2023, over 80 countries had connected to CIPS. Russia used it to sell oil to China and India without dollars. Brazil used it to buy Chinese manufactured goods in yuan. Saudi Arabia started accepting yuan for oil sales, something that would have been unthinkable 5 years earlier. The petrodollar system, the foundation of American financial dominance since 1974, was quietly being dismantled, not through war or sanctions, through patient, deliberate engineering and the $500 billion Treasury sell-off. That was just China clearing the runway. Here's how it works. If you're China and you want to transition away from the dollar system, you can't do it overnight. You're holding over $1 trillion in US debt. If you dump it all at once, you create a crisis that destroys your own reserves. The bonds lose value. The dollar spikes. Your export economy collapses. So you do it slowly. Over 18 months, you sell $500 billion. You rotate into gold, which China has been accumulating at record levels. You rotate into euros, yen, and other currencies. You increase yuan-denominated trade agreements. And most importantly, you build the infrastructure that allows other countries to join you without facing immediate economic collapse. You turn the nuclear option into a slow bleed, and then you wait for the moment when holding dollars becomes more dangerous than abandoning them. That moment is coming faster than most people realize, because China isn't just selling US debt, it's offering something else, a way out. In August 2023, during the BRICS summit in Johannesburg, leaders from Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa discussed something that sent quiet shockwaves through financial ministries around the world. Not a BRICS currency, that was the headline everyone focused on, but something more practical and more dangerous: bilateral trade agreements that bypass the dollar entirely. Brazil and China trading soybeans for electronics in their own currencies. India and Russia trading oil for rupees. Saudi Arabia and China trading energy for yuan. These weren't theoretical proposals. These were active agreements already processing billions in transactions. And every single one of them reduced global dollar demand. Now here's where it gets interesting. The United States has responded to this the only way it knows how: by weaponizing the financial system even further. Since 2018, the U.S. has frozen Russian foreign reserves, sanctioned Chinese technology companies, threatened secondary sanctions on countries that trade with Iran, and used the SWIFT payment system as a political tool. Every time Washington does this, it proves China's point that holding dollars and participating in the dollar system isn't safe. It's a vulnerability. You can't threaten people with a weapon and then expect them to keep storing that weapon in their basement. So they're leaving, not dramatically, not all at once, but consistently, methodically, irreversibly. And here's the truly dangerous part: the U.S. can't stop them without causing the very crisis it's trying to prevent. If the Federal Reserve raises interest rates too high to defend the dollar, it makes U.S. debt unsustainable and crashes the domestic economy. If it keeps rates low, inflation spirals, and foreign holders lose confidence even faster. If it tries to restrict capital flows or force countries to hold dollars, it accelerates the exodus by proving the system is coercive rather than voluntary. It's a trap with no exit. And China designed it that way. Remember what I said earlier: holding someone's debt doesn't make you powerful if you can't sell it. For 30 years, that was true. China was locked in. But over the last decade, Beijing did something brilliant. It built an alternative system, piece by piece: payment networks, currency swap agreements, gold reserves, regional trade blocs, so that by the time it started selling treasuries, it had somewhere else to go. The trap reversed. Now, it's America that can't afford to let the system collapse, because if Treasury bonds stop being the safest asset on earth, the U.S. loses its ability to borrow at cheap rates. The national debt becomes unpayable. Interest costs explode. The government has to choose between defaulting on obligations or printing money and triggering hyperinflation. Both options end the same way: the destruction of the dollar's reserve currency status. And that's not a financial problem. That's a geopolitical catastrophe, because America's military dominance, its diplomatic leverage, its ability to sanction enemies and reward allies, all of it runs on the assumption that the world needs dollars. The moment that stops being true, the United States becomes just another country. Powerful, yes, but no longer exceptional. No longer unquestionable. China knows this. And that $500 billion sell-off, that wasn't the end game. That was the warning shot. Because if you look closely at what China is doing right now, stockpiling gold at levels not seen since the 1970s, expanding yuan trade agreements, building financial infrastructure across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, you realize this isn't about destroying the dollar quickly. It's about replacing it slowly enough that by the time America notices, it's already too late to stop. And we're watching it happen in real time. The International Monetary Fund reported that the dollar's share of global reserves dropped to 58% in 2023. That might not sound dramatic, but 10 years ago, it was 65%. 20 years ago, it was 71%. The trend is clear, consistent, accelerating. And every percentage point that declines represents billions of dollars in reduced demand for U.S. treasuries, which means higher borrowing costs for the American government, which means more debt, which means more pressure on the Federal Reserve to print money, which means more inflation, which means more reason for foreign holders to sell. It's a feedback loop, and it's already started. So when you hear that China sold $500 billion in U.S. debt, don't think of it as a past event. Think of it as the beginning of a process that hasn't finished yet. Because the real question isn't whether China will keep selling, it's whether anyone will keep buying. Before we move forward, sit with this question for a moment. Why did that single word, no, matter so much? Einstein didn't endorse the idea. He didn't declare it correct. He didn't crown a new truth. So why did that moment echo through an entire lifetime? Almost everyone gets this wrong. We think progress comes from answers, from conclusions, from being right. But the deepest shifts in human understanding don't start with answers. They start with permission. Permission to think differently without being ridiculed. Permission to explore without needing immediate validation. Permission to be wrong in an interesting way. That's what was given in that room. Here's the strange part. The respect wasn't about physics. It was about posture, about how a mind relates to reality. Most people, once they reach a certain height, start confusing their ideas with themselves. Question the idea, and it feels like a personal attack. Disagree, and you're seen as a threat. That's how knowledge ossifies. That's how fields stagnate while pretending to be stable. Einstein could have shut the door easily. He had every social right to do so. His name alone could end conversations. But instead, he separated himself from his ideas. He treated them as tools, not as identity. Pause and imagine how rare that is. Ask yourself honestly, how often do you defend a belief not because it's true, but because it's yours? How often does disagreement feel uncomfortable even when it's gentle? This isn't a flaw unique to scientists. It's human. And that's why this moment matters outside physics. Because what happened next didn't just shape a career. It shaped a way of thinking. The young man in that room didn't walk away thinking, I was right. He walked away thinking, ideas can breathe. That curiosity doesn't need permission from authority. That respect is not obedience, it's engagement. And here's where things start to ripple. Years later, when faced with problems that everyone else avoided because they were too messy, this mindset returned. Problems filled with contradictions, ugly edges, places where existing explanations work just well enough to hide their cracks. Most people avoid cracks. They're uncomfortable. They make you question foundations. But cracks are where light gets in if you're willing to look. Instead of asking, what's the accepted method? A different question took priority. What's actually happening? Not in the language of textbooks, in the language of reality. This approach feels almost childish at first. Simple questions, naive questions, the kind people stop asking because they seem embarrassing. But those questions have a strange power. They ignore tradition. They go straight for intuition. For example, instead of calculating endlessly, imagine every possible path something could take, not just the one it should take, all of them. Let reality decide which ones matter. This sounds vague, almost mystical, but it turned out to be one of the most effective ways to think ever discovered. Here's the strange part. When you stop demanding that nature speak your language and instead listen to how it behaves, complexity often becomes simpler, not easier, simpler. This way of thinking didn't come from brilliance alone. It came from safety. The safety of knowing that questioning giants doesn't mean disrespect, that being wrong isn't fatal if you're honest, and that safety traces back to moments like the one with Einstein. You might be thinking, but isn't science supposed to be objective anyway? In theory, yes. In practice, humans do science, and humans bring fear, pride, and habit into the room. That's why role models matter, not as heroes, as examples of behavior. Einstein didn't just show how to think about space and time, he showed how to think about thinking, how to hold ideas lightly, how to remain a student even when the world calls you a master. This is where things break again. Because most educational systems don't teach this. They teach conclusions, finished stories, polished results. They rarely show the confusion, the doubt, the half-formed ideas that lead somewhere new. So students learn that intelligence looks like certainty, but real intelligence often looks like hesitation, like saying, I don't know yet, like being willing to follow a strange idea just far enough to see whether it collapses or opens a door. The respect shown in that room planted a seed, and that seed grew into a style that many later misunderstood. Playful, unorthodox, sometimes dismissive of formalism, but underneath deeply serious. Not serious about reputation, serious about truth. This is why later, when diagrams replaced dense paragraphs, when intuition replaced rigid procedure, it wasn't rebellion, it was continuity, the same spirit, the same permission to ask, what's really going on here? And this brings us to an uncomfortable realization. Progress often doesn't come from the loudest voices or the most decorated ones. It comes from environments where young ideas aren't suffocated, where saying that's interesting is more common than saying that's impossible. Think about your own life for a moment. Where did your best ideas come from? The moments you felt most alive intellectually, were they when someone told you exactly what to think, or when someone listened seriously to a thought you weren't sure about yourself? Respect isn't agreement, it's attention. That single seminar didn't make anyone famous overnight, but it shaped an internal compass, a reminder that the goal isn't to protect theories, it's to understand nature a little better than yesterday. And here's the part most people miss. Einstein didn't lose anything by saying no. He didn't diminish himself. He expanded the space of possibility. He modeled intellectual humility at the highest level. That act quietly gave permission to generations that followed. There's a subtle idea hiding underneath this entire story, and it's easy to miss if you focus only on the people involved. This was never really about Einstein or about a young physicist standing at a blackboard. It was about how reality itself seems to respond to certain ways of thinking. Here's the strange part. The universe doesn't reward confidence. It rewards curiosity. That sounds poetic, but sit with it for a moment. The universe doesn't care how sure you are. It doesn't bend because your theory is elegant or your reputation is large. It only responds when your questions line up with how things actually behave. This is where many brilliant minds quietly fail. They become guardians of answers instead of explorers of questions. They defend conclusions instead of interrogating assumptions. And slowly, almost invisibly, curiosity turns into maintenance. But the deepest discoveries don't come from polishing what we already believe. They come from noticing where our stories feel strained. Think about this. Every time physics made a major leap, it wasn't because someone added detail to an old picture. It was because someone noticed that the picture itself was wrong or incomplete or hiding something uncomfortable. Time felt absolute until it didn't. Space felt rigid until it bent. Cause and effect felt one-directional until reality suggested it might be more subtle. Each time, the same pattern appears. Someone asks a question that feels inappropriate. Something like, what if we're thinking about this backward? Or what if this thing we're ignoring actually matters? Most people don't like those questions. They destabilize the mental furniture. They force you to admit that understanding is provisional. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The universe seems to prefer people who are willing to feel lost. That seminar was a small example of this on a human scale. A young idea was allowed to exist without being crushed, not because it was guaranteed to be right, but because it was honestly curious. And that honesty matters more than we like to admit. You might be thinking, but isn't science supposed to eliminate uncertainty? That's the myth. Science doesn't eliminate uncertainty. It manages it. It turns confusion into better questions. Certainty feels good. It feels like rest. But it's often the end of movement. Curiosity feels unstable. It keeps you awake. It makes you uneasy, but it's alive. The reason that moment with Einstein mattered is because it aligned with how discovery actually happens. Nature doesn't reveal itself to people who demand clean answers too early. It reveals itself to those willing to sit with ambiguity. Here's a simple, everyday analogy. Imagine trying to understand a person by labeling them quickly. They're kind, they're selfish. Once you do that, you stop paying attention. But if you admit you don't fully understand them, you watch more closely. You notice patterns, contradictions, context. Reality works the same way. When you rush to closure, you stop listening. This is why the later breakthroughs that followed that mindset didn't look traditional. They didn't arrive as polished monuments. They arrived as tools for thinking, visual shortcuts, intuitive frameworks, ways of asking better questions rather than declaring final truths. That style confused some people. They mistook playfulness for lack of rigor. They thought simplicity meant superficiality. But underneath, there was a deep respect for how fragile understanding actually is. Here's where things break again. We often assume intelligence is about having strong opinions. In reality, it's often about knowing which opinions to hold lightly. The universe is not obligated to match our expectations. Every generation learns this the hard way. Ideas that once felt unshakable become footnotes, not because they were foolish, but because they were incomplete. And incompleteness is not a flaw. It's a feature of learning. That's why the story of respect matters more than the story of correctness. The idea presented that day didn't become the final word, but the attitude behind it shaped future questions that did matter enormously. Think about this. If that idea had been dismissed outright, not argued against, not explored, just brushed away, what message would that send? Not just to one person, but to everyone watching. It would say, only finished ideas are welcome here, but finished ideas don't grow. By saying no in the way he did, Einstein modeled something subtle but powerful. He showed that disagreement doesn't have to be annihilation, that criticism doesn't have to be contempt, that you can challenge without closing. This mirrors something deeper about the universe itself. Reality pushes back, but it doesn't humiliate you for being wrong. It simply fails to behave the way you expected. If you pay attention, that failure becomes information. The universe doesn't punish bad ideas, it ignores them. The danger isn't being wrong, the danger is becoming uncurious. This is why the greatest thinkers often sound uncertain when you read them closely. They hedge, they speculate, they leave doors open, not because they're weak, but because they know how easily confidence can harden into blindness. Ask yourself this: when was the last time you changed your mind about something important? Not because you were forced to, but because curiosity pulled you there. That pull is rare, and it requires an environment where questions aren't immediately weaponized. That seminar room, for one brief moment, became such an environment, and it left a lasting imprint. The lesson wasn't challenge authority and you'll be rewarded. That's too simplistic. The lesson was take reality seriously enough to risk being wrong. That's a different kind of courage. If you've stayed this far, you've probably felt it, that quiet shift, the realization that this story isn't really about physics at all. It's about how ideas are born, how they survive, and how easily they can be suffocated. Here's the strange part. Most of the limits we feel aren't imposed by reality. They're imposed by fear. Fear of looking foolish, fear of being wrong, fear of not being taken seriously. And that fear often disguises itself as wisdom. We tell ourselves we're waiting until we know more, until we're ready, until the idea is good enough. But beneath that patience is often a quiet belief that unfinished thoughts don't deserve daylight. That belief is deadly to creativity. Think back to that moment again. A young mind offering something incomplete. A great mind responding not with dismissal, but with openness. That exchange didn't advance science directly. It advanced something more fragile, intellectual courage. This is where everything connects, because the same pattern plays out everywhere. In art, in business, in relationships, in your own thinking. New ideas don't arrive fully formed. They arrive awkward, vague, slightly embarrassing. They need space before they need judgment. But our culture trains us to skip that space, to present only polished versions of ourselves, to speak only when certain, to equate hesitation with weakness. Reality doesn't work that way. The universe itself is unfinished, still unfolding, still experimenting, still allowing structures to emerge, collapse, and reconfigure. Why would understanding it be any different? Here's an uncomfortable thought. If you demand certainty from yourself before exploring, you are asking more than reality itself ever offers. Einstein understood this deeply, even if he never said it out loud. His greatest contribution may not have been any single theory, but his refusal to treat his own ideas as sacred. He remained at heart a questioner. That's what earned him real respect, not authority, vulnerability. And that's what he recognized in someone else. Respect, in its deepest form, isn't about hierarchy. It's about recognizing the same hunger for truth in another mind, even when that mind is young. even when the idea is strange, even when it challenges something you built yourself. Pause for a moment and ask yourself, where in your life have you been protecting answers instead of exploring questions? Where have you shut down curiosity because it felt uncomfortable? This isn't about abandoning standards. It's about remembering why standards exist, to serve understanding, not to replace it. The irony is that when you stop clinging so tightly to being right, you often become more accurate. You notice more. You listen better. You adapt faster. The universe doesn't need you to be certain. It needs you to be honest. And honesty often sounds like, I'm not sure yet, but this feels worth looking at. That sentence changes everything. This is why the story matters. Not because someone earned respect from a legend, but because it shows what respect actually looks like when it's real. It looks like listening, like restraint, like leaving room for growth. In a world obsessed with outcomes, this is almost revolutionary. So here's the final thought I want to leave you with. The next time you encounter an idea that unsettles you, resist the urge to dismiss it immediately. Sit with the discomfort. Ask what assumption it's pressing against. Curiosity is often hidden inside irritation. And the next time you hesitate to share a thought because it feels incomplete, remember this: the most important ideas in history were once incomplete thoughts in someone's mind. They didn't wait for permission, they waited for courage. If this way of thinking resonates with you, if it made you pause, reflect, or feel slightly uncomfortable in a good way, then don't let it end here. Like the video if it challenged you. Subscribe if you want more conversations like this. And most importantly, share your thoughts in the comments, not polished answers, honest questions, because the future doesn't belong to the most certain minds. It belongs to the most curious ones.